Hello, welcome to the Story in Life podcast with David and Dale.
I'm David. He's Dale.
Hey. Now, what we're talking about today is could be broadly labeled as misunderstanding or understanding, or
Yeah, hermeneutics might be a big word for it, or questions of interpretation. But yeah, talking about the different ways we use words, the different things we mean by them, and how that we can't take that for granted.
so in order to
And to understand someone, you have to know what they mean when they say something.
and in order to introduce the discussion, we're going to start with a story. 2 weeks ago,
Once upon a time.
once upon a time in the at least as far back
Long
as
ago
September.
and far, far away.
David and I sat down to have a discussion about a recent trip to the States. Now, over the course of this trip, we had questions as to why the other person was doing things in a certain way. For example, David...
We learned that Dale doesn't travel right.
Yeah, Dale travels wrongly. We also learned that... No. You had a question as to why I introduced myself as Métis.
Yeah, we spent some time, we got talking, I guess that's the place to begin. When we were in the States, we spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different people from a lot of different places in a lot of different contexts. And throughout that, I think both of us noticed that we engaged in those discussions in very, very different ways. Particularly how we framed our identity, and then from that position, how we approached the other.
Mm-hmm. And, we would talk to a person, and I would want to express a concept to them, so I would establish who I was in a way that I could use to explain the concept, and this seems strange to you.
Yeah. Well, I noticed, it seemed like many of our conversations, the point when you started speaking, it began with, I am Métis, this is what it means to be Métis, and this is my Métis history, and from that point you would speak. And, I didn't do that. I'm like, well, you have a perspective, what about this? Or I think this, and it's different. And I never grounded my discussion in terms of, this is my identity.
Or this is my community. This is my community. At the same time, I had problems sometimes with your lack of willingness to admit that you were from a different community. And I've noted, I've realized since that I've had that problem with other people who, to me, seem to believe that they can exist separate from community to my perception because of how I interpret the actions of those around me.
So you wondered why didn't I introduce myself by saying I am whatever?
Yeah.
In short.
Now, after we got back from the States, we sat down and decided that we would go over some of the things that we had learned from talking to various people in the States, specifically Mark.
Yeah.
Mark. And after a few very brief minutes of discussing how we had understood these people in terms of the stories they told, our discussion got sidetracked into what ended up to be a 30-minute back and forth of why in the world, Dale, why are you doing this? Why are you introducing yourself in this way? And I'm like, well, David, why aren't you? And how, and David would say things like, my presence, the very fact that I am there gives me...
Well, yeah, we got talking about what gives you a stake in a conversation. What gives you the right to speak?
The right to speak, yeah.
And I said, my presence in the conversation, my bodily presence there in front of the other person gives me the right to speak. It gives me a stake in the conversation, and it gives me a stake in the place that I'm at.
Mm-hmm. Whereas, I don't buy that. I mean, it gives you some stake, but... I had to disagree with it on some level, and I don't think you could understand why I would disagree with that. And I couldn't understand, there was a breakdown of understanding that left me, really thinking about this. Why in the world does David see the world so differently from me?
Yeah.
Or why do I see the world so differently from David? And probably 2 or 3 days later, it hit me. Now, David describes himself as, or identifies as, a third culture kid.
Among other things.
Other things. And one of the narratives of a third culture kid is how can I put this? I almost want you to explain this. I want to say
Yeah, it's not even a narrative. It's an
a
experience.
lack of a narrative.
No, it's yeah. Growing up with a third culture kid. I mean, I think the easiest way to put this is maybe to work through some of the different ways we approach language, because that's what my story is going to entail, is our different use of language. Yeah, I mean, the short version is, as a third culture kid, my conception of home and community and family is also connected into that, and culture, and yeah, is very different from Dale's, and very different from most people's. They say third culture kids have the most in common with other third culture kids. They don't self-identify with a given culture because often because they move too much.
And well, me on the other hand,
let's talk language.
Okay, let's
do that, because we'll be able to talk. What
we're trying to do is give a framework for. We're still trying to explain why we viewed why we approach the question of permission to speak or validity of stake in a given conversation so differently.
Yeah. So yeah, let's start. Should we start with home or family or community?
Doesn't really matter.
Part of this I've been thinking about, because it was a post I made in an online discussion the other day talking about different ways of understanding words, because somebody was trying to tell me that there are very, very strict definitions of words and I should know what they mean. And I said, well, I don't, and here's why. And this was some of it was from other parts of my childhood, but one of the things I said is home is where I sleep at night. And that's my definition. That's home. I used to say, actually, when I was overseas, I said home is where my computer is. What is home to you, Dale?
For me, home is where my parents live.
Okay.
And I also can feel comfortable where I'm sleeping. But if I say I'm going home for the weekend, I very clearly mean the house that I grew up in, the field, that surrounds it, the valley that it's in, and the mountains around it, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
which entails a particular set of histories and narratives, and also emotional content or affective content.
And also a relative importance of the concept of the term home to what it means to be me.
Yeah, and I don't have that, because to me, home can change. I've lived in 1, 2, 4... By the time I was 14, I'd lived in 8 different houses in 6 different communities.
See, and us, even though...
At least 8 different houses, possibly more.
Even though I think I've moved 8 times, that was only in 3 different houses.
Yeah. And understand, when I say 6 different communities, that goes from Nova Scotia to Vancouver.
Whereas when I moved, it was still within the context of the same logging community, the same church community. And in fact, sometimes we even loaded our house on a logging truck and took it with us.
Yeah. So to me, home has a very practical definition and not much emotional contact.
And it's not necessarily a concept that you would reach for right off the shelf if it came time to say who you were.
No. And yeah, when I say I say I'm going to visit my dad, sometimes I call that home, but when I do that, I often end up, I refer to anywhere I've lived as home at that point, and it's certainly not the same qualitative distinction that you're making. Home for me is here, it's CUC, it's Vancouver where my dad lives, it could be Chetwynd, it could be Macau. Those are the main places
And I would say that this also means that when other people refer to home, you don't automatically assume that they refer to who they are.
Yeah, I assume potentially where you sleep at night. I realize that many people attach histories and emotional content to that, and so I can inquire into that. But yeah, they say that's actually one of the worst things that you can ask a TCK is, where are you from? And that's a pretty foundational thing for TCKs. You don't ask where are you from, because to me, where am I from means usually where did I live before I lived here. Usually now I just say I'm from Victoria, and that's the end of the story.
That puts another light on the question of always asking anybody who looks like they're from somewhere else where they're from, because the good,
who does that?
Who does that?
You say let me be a TCK, but who does that?
People for whom the concept of home is very integral to who they are. I meet somebody who strikes me as very interesting and from somewhere else. One of the first things I want to ask is, where are you from? What is your home? What is your background?
Okay.
And
I think I do that.
If you look at
But usually I mean, what is your culture and language more than what is your place?
Yeah, and that's what I mean too. What is your culture and language, but as well as what is your place? Not to devalidify devalidate your existence here, but if that person is a displaced person in a very real way who has grown up, say, in Canada, but their parents are from somewhere else, they are going to potentially have that aversion to asking, where are you from?
Yeah.
In a way that I can't understand.
Should actually probably clarify at this point. When I say TCK, third culture kid is technically defined as a kid who's grown up in a culture that is not their parents' home culture. And so while they're heavily influenced through their parents by the culture their parents came from, they've never been part of that culture. They live in a different one. And as a result, they end up somewhere in the middle. They end up in a third culture, which is generally unique to them, which is why TCKs connect, is because they don't... TCKs do not connect on a shared culture. They connect on a shared experience of their lack of culture in a way.
A shared presence at the table.
Yeah, that might be a way to say it.
Well, let's go into the next term then, which...
I would actually say after that, what's a hometown, which we've sort of touched that. I don't have a hometown.
Hometown? To me, hometown really isn't...
Well, or where are you from? I mean, is the other form that question takes. And I assume for you that's Hazelton.
You know what? I have a much clearer definition of community than I do of hometown.
Okay.
Because I've lived within the same community despite having moved several times.
Okay. But you're still from Hazelton. I mean, most of the time when you talk to people, that's... Yeah. Okay.
Hazelton.
Yeah. I'm like... I was happy today. I found out that Facebook has finally has finally decided I can answer that I do not have a hometown as opposed to picking one of the places I've lived. Because that's always been a problem.
Nice.
My Facebook account has been linked to various locales around the world at various times.
Okay, so what do you mean when you say community?
Oh. That would depend on the context. I think at some level community to me is something that I choose. It's a volitional affiliation. Choosing to belong to a group of people. If I talk about, so my community is usually a community I think of it in terms of the community I've made rather than a community I've been born into, because I was not born into a community per se, except maybe Adventism, but even that is not something I am a passive recipient of in any sense whatsoever. What is community? I guess another part of that would be that community is people with shared values, interests, culture, language, potentially, but none of those are necessary. Ultimately, it's the community to me implies the choice to be together, the choice to identify as a group, and it's very connected to how I define family.
I think this is going to be a very revealing difference between our views of community, in that community, yes, is something that I choose to belong to, but everything that you just mentioned is true of community, yet community is with me in a much more real way. More real, but more present way?
In a different way.
In that...
Let's not make a hierarchy out of this, because it isn't.
It's a different way. I'll say this
Except when I'm right, but...
Let's go back to our talk about traveling down to the States. When I was traveling to the States, I didn't leave my community behind in any way.
What is your community?
My community is I didn't leave my conceptualization of community away in any community behind. Let's put it that way. My community is the neighborhood that I grew up in, and that would be both the local kids, but then also the Adventist kids, and then also the logging kids. So there are 3 or 4 kind of overlapping communities, and it's also the history. Also my Métis community or half-breed community with its own histories and views, and here's where I want to say is that my community, my view of communities is also a way of viewing people as communities and being aware of people's community affiliations as a very immediate part of identifying people.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that's I think part of the difference. Is at some level community is something that is something other people belong to. I do not belong to community except as I choose to enter into community and join it. And even then, because of that, my relationship is very different.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can say in Victoria I belong to a number of different communities, but those communities are going to exist after I leave, and they existed before I came. And I am just a temporary part of that community.
Yeah, and when somebody sees me, I assume that they look at me and they assign me to not what type of an individual is he, but what communities what communities does this person belong. I assume that this is a very important part of how people make their judgments about other people, and this led to the way in which we, to my mind, this is what led to the difference is in how we dealt in this with meeting new people and having these discussions about identity while we were down in the southern states.
Yeah.
When I thought about this later on, I realized that when I traveled in a place, I assume that they know that I'm from the north, and I assume that they have baggage associated with that, cultural baggage that comes from being in their community, and that I'm going to be the recipient of that baggage, simply by being an outsider, and also coming from a community that also does this to outsiders. You know, we have this assumption that people who come from outside and
from away,
and people from away, people who are that they're going to misunderstand you, and that they are then going to assume that they are right in their misunderstandings, and they are then going to interpret everything that you do based on their misunderstandings, and that there's nothing that you can do about it except be annoyed at them for it. And
see, I've always been the guy who's come from away and had my motives misunderstood because I wasn't part of the community.
Yeah. And so we talk about, we come from very different types of minorities, and that you would be an outsider without a community, as you would kind of like you come as an individual.
I don't think of myself as coming from a minority. I just am.
Yeah.
I'm singular.
And I don't see myself as singular, but still being somebody who has to deal with, that. How to put it now?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Is this important? I was going to start talking about how this played out in the ground.
Well, that's what I want to get to. Yeah.
Okay. I guess. I mean, what I noticed, what the difference that stood out to me. I mean, we sort of touched on this. Is to me, when I go to a new place, I enter into the community there. I don't go there and say, well, I'm not part of this community, so I don't have a stake. I say I'm here, therefore I am part of this community because I'm here, and the place I came from is my history. It's not my identity. And so when I enter, and like I said, my presence is literally my stake in the community, that I'm there, and I can claim that community to the degree in which I am engaged with it. If I do not engage, I'm not part of the community. If I start into the conversation, at that point, I become part of the community. And Dale always confused me. I don't know if it was quite confusion, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me that every time Dale spoke, he would start by, again, I am Métis.
Often.
It happened enough that I noticed it as a pattern.
Yeah.
I am Métis, and this is my community, and this is my community history, and then he would say what he had to say.
Yeah, and sometimes it was, I'm Canadian within this background. And, okay, so on the ground then, I come from the assumption that that community is a very big part of how people interpret me. I assume that people bring their community to the table when they meet me, and that my conversation with you is not a meeting of two individuals. It's a meeting of me with a community, and that community has baggage at which, knowing stories about a specific community, for example, knowing the history of the American Civil War, and the history of North-South relations following that, with the history of the carpetbaggers and intense political interference and economic interference and massive, just messing with local people's ability to express themselves and to have any stake in their own futures. I assume that I'm in a place where people have similar views to interfering outsiders. And so my first step in order to be understood is to situate myself as from something outside of that paradigm, which is a way that allows me to interact with people. But to me, this is an ability to see, because to me this is something that's just so obvious to me that I would never assume that a person, like.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I disregard what you're saying.
Uh-huh.
I say it differently. The biggest thing I don't understand is, say, you said, I'm trying to remember exactly your phrase. It's something to the effect of being from a community. When you talk, you are your community, or you are from your community, you belong to your community, you represent your community. And I don't understand. I don't have any experience whatsoever that I can guide that. I can understand that in terms of stories that I've read, or otherwise encountered, that you have a representative of the community. But to say that I am a representative of my community is meaningless because I don't have a community.
Yeah, and for me, this isn't just a way in which I view myself. I mean, sure, this isn't just a way in which I view myself. This is a way in which I assume others view me.
Yeah.
And that is where it makes
Dale,
a massive...
I don't view you that way.
Yeah. And
Except
that is...
as you force me to.
And so my assumption as to the types of potential conflicts that are going to happen because of the history of my community and the history of this community, the history, community histories are at play when we deal with each other, and it's something that we have to deal with, as we try to form a one-to-one relationship, so to speak.
And see, but that I recognize. I mean, that's part of, like, in some ways we end up in the same place, but we come at it from very different ways.
Yeah. And so I have problems with some third culture kids who I find will go into situations talking to people and saying things that to me feel like the height of ignorance, because maybe they are, but it's just a belief that your presence gives you a stake, when to my mind many times our presence has already been tarnished by 1,000 years of history, or hundreds of years of history.
Yeah. Huh.
Which,
See, I don't understand that because I can't. Yeah. I don't have any grounds to relate to that at all.
So this is one example of where language
fails. Pretty miserably. Yeah. I mean, and that's, but the flip of that though is I can be aware of many of the same concerns in a conversation. But I don't talk about community histories. I talk about cultural histories. And so I can recognize within a certain culture, these are the narratives that circulate. This is the way power flows. And these are the things that may that may bear on a particular encounter, a particular conversation or whatever. But I don't assume those as being determinative. I assume them as potentials, because I tend to think, okay, this is an encounter with an individual who may have any sort of relationship to this culture.
Yeah, and I think, I don't view this as being determinative, but the extent to which I would
but it is. I think you
a percentage
determinative not in an extreme degree, but I think in a way that's much more than it is for me.
Yeah, in a very different level, to where I am making certain assumptions as to what is really at stake, that for you different things are at stake perhaps than are for me initially at stake, even as we try to...
I don't follow.
Oh.
I mean, I think part of that has to do with... I'm going to try and guess at where you're going.
We bring different baggage.
I don't know if it's different baggage. To you, maybe it's a question of identity is at stake, in the sense where, to me, let me put it this way. So for you, community is assumed, and therefore identity is at stake. For me, identity is at some level assumed, but something to be discovered, and therefore community is at stake.
I don't follow.
That doesn't make sense? Okay. I don't know. I guess, I'm sort of trying to think this through, that you, again, when you speak, you have to establish an identity first.
Okay. Not that I have to establish identity, but I have to...
Well, you establish an identity in terms of community. You say, this is who I am, this is my history, this is the position I'm speaking from. Maybe, and I say, well, I'm here, and I'm speaking, and let's make a community together.
Yeah, and to me...
They're not even opposing, they're just different paradigms, I think.
Yeah, to me, okay, here's how I would say it, is that my assumptions regarding what are the greatest barriers to communication are different.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah,
okay.
So my assumptions regarding I assume that the greatest barriers to communication between me and you are the assumptions that are inherent within our specific communities. And my first step to do that yeah,
that must give you grief because I don't have a community for you to identify.
Yeah, and so my first step in clarifying that is to step out of the obvious.
Keep going.
I try and the first step in establishing in allowing for a person to person connection is not to establish my identity, but is to establish, saying who I am is a way of doing this. But what I'm trying to do is to break out of the person shaped mold, whatever that the other person has for that I assume that they've already put me into, and put my ideas into. And I'm assuming that they already have a framework, a community, a cultural based framework for which to interpret me and what I say.
Do you do that when you encounter people?
I don't know. I assume I do. I think we always do.
I don't know the we you're talking about, because I don't think I do that, because I don't think in those terms.
I mean, I don't
because I don't conceive my own identity in those terms.
I guess everywhere I go in the world around me, though, I constantly see people misunderstanding each other because of the assumptions that they have made. I see these assumptions being made all the time.
Yeah.
And so to me, these types of assumptions and these types of misunderstandings are a fact of life, and my first step to avoiding them is to avoid being cast in a category.
And see, but see, I do that too, to some degree. I'm aware of how that happens, but I think I come at it from an entirely different way, because I tend to approach people as individuals. I tend not to, until somebody gives me a reason to, I don't generally assume them to be representative of their community. I tend to be them. I assume them to be representative of themselves and their own decisions and their own history. And community is just one thing that has influenced that. But
I assume that their own different past and their community. I mean, how can I say? I approach people as individuals, but I still expect them to be equipped with a useful method for making snap judgments, which are going to be applied whether they want to or not, because that's how people go from point A to point B, is applying their memories into the future, so to speak.
You're not really making a lot of sense to me.
Okay. Well,
I'm just going to put that out there. I guess
well,
one example maybe to work this out, maybe we can work this through. Thinking about Avatar, because I think we had somewhat different perspectives of Avatar and what its value was. I find Avatar a fascinating film, and I thought it was a really great film, because I think there's a value to... And this is not to say third culture kid is the greatest thing in the world, but I think there is a life-giving potential to in people that cross boundaries between cultures. And so when I watch Avatar, to me that's what it's about. It's about this guy who leaves his own culture and joins another community, and in the act of the transition, in the act of crossing that boundary, opens the possibility of life. Opens up for a future that could not have happened otherwise. I mean, within the film, the whatever they were called would have been wiped out, except for him. And it to me, it's incidental then that he's white, and they're not. The point is the crossing, and the crossing, the way he crossed had to be was of significance because of the power differential. Because somebody crossing from the weak side to the weak culture to the strong culture, the dominant culture, doesn't necessarily carry the same potential for life. The same power, I guess. I don't know how to say that, but and I know, talking to you, I seem to recall you read it much more as a conflict of communities, and there were particular stakes in that.
Well, I'll say the first way I read it was also tied up with a history.
Yeah. Which
is that watching the movie, I saw imagery time after time, and almost direct, some of the imagery of the animals and the ways in which the Na'vi, all swooped up and grabbed them and galloped off back home. There were set scenes that were straight out of paintings on the sides of teepees. So I mean, there was like, to me, the parallels were incredibly intentional, and I had a very hard time not viewing it as just another white savior story, because the parallels were there intentionally so.
Yeah.
In the same way that, not Captain Smith, but like Dances with Wolves, people have a lot of problems with those stories.
Yeah, Pocahontas.
Because they all paint the Na'vi as being incapable of culturally moving forward without the influence of an outside, not recognizing that you could be your own outsider within your community? Or there's a reason why we don't have movies about Tecumseh.
We don't?
There may be, but I've never heard of them. Good question.
I know there's Geronimo.
Yeah.
But I guess do you I guess I see some of that though as a difference of some of the differences as being how communities relate and how we relate to community, because I don't see it as a connection between particular communities as much as about the individual who refuses to be defined by either community. And it seems like you approach it more in terms of the community.
I honestly don't remember. What you're saying makes sense.
Let's not worry about that then.
Okay. I was saying,
that didn't help, I don't think.
I mean, we originally got into this because we were talking about the frailties of language when it comes to communication.
Yeah. We should probably just cut that whole section about Avatar.
Bop, bop, bop.
Okay, so where were we? For that, you were talking about.
Well, we established that we view community in a very different way, and that it leads to a misunderstanding, which we then proceeded to spend another 10 minutes more or less confused about what each other was saying.
Yeah, we still don't have a neat way past this.
And at the heart is language.
Yeah, and the ways in which we often take language for granted. We assume that when we approach someone else and say, well, where are you from? We usually, traditionally, that there is one answer to that. And that answer is going to be, some might say objectively true, that you are from Hazleton. Mm-hmm. And that is verifiable, and there is only one answer to that question. And I cannot begin to tell you what kind of objective answer would be appropriate for me. I can tell you where I'm born. We also assume that
when somebody asks where are you from, they're asking the same thing, which again faces the same barriers within different communities.
Well, and that's why you just don't. TCKs don't like to ask those questions,
which is
and don't like to be asked those questions.
Within one of the languages that I was documenting, Scots, you ask where are you from before you ask somebody what their name is.
What kind of answer would you give to that?
Well, the answer you would give would tell me your community, it would tell me your nation, your family, your heritage, what your connection to the land is. I mean, your social responsibilities, your network. I mean, your answer would tell me who you were. Simply by asking you where you were from, I would know who you were. Then you would you might throw your name on afterwards, which would be useful. But
well, that some sense that makes sense. I have trouble remembering people's names until I know their story. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't tend to connect story with place in the same way. To me, where I'm from is more of maybe a sum of my experiences and the different places I've been, yeah. But then again, my answer to my identity. I mean, we actually talked about this the other night. Who I am, my question is very different. I tend to answer that question differently depending where I am, who I'm with, what my context is, and I can give you many answers to my identity. Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't think any of them is very representative of the entirety of me.
Now, what are other situations where this problem with language plays out?
I mean, for me, for us, I think well, yeah, the easy answer is within interfaith discussions or even within a faith. Mm-hmm. I mean, I see it I encounter it most tangibly in what they talk about as, the liberal and conservative divide, where people assume. Actually, that's not even a good way to do it. I was
just thinking of an example.
Question.
Okay, if I say God loves you,
yeah.
On one hand, it's a very simple statement. Yet there are many different interpretations of what I mean when I use the word God. Millions, very significant. And to me, these are very important distinctions. There's just as many ways of interpreting the word loves, which to me are inextricably tied up with the term God. And when I say you, again, this is tied up. It's the way in which you interpret this, word is very different. I mean, we say Jesus died for you, and it can mean so many different things. And it's a meaningful statement within completely different conceptualizations of salvation, of the cross, and
we can't assume that.
And language totally breaks down at clarifying that.
Yeah.
Without narrative to give it shape.
And I think part of how we can ground this is I think this has been something we've had differences over. And we've had the conversation many times about community, and I'm happy you finally start to grasp the difference, because I've told you before, because I'm a TCK, I don't assume things that you're assuming in this conversation, and I don't know you fully understood that before.
Well, I
still don't know you fully understand that, but you didn't understand it much at all in some points.
Yeah, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how to apply it in a way that would. Yeah, I guess what I didn't understand was why you wouldn't understand some things. I assumed, okay, you come from this perspective, but yeah,
you assume that I come from a perspective. And I guess that is I don't know. I guess what I mean by that. I mean, one way I think about framing it is for somebody, and this is it's oversimplification, but if you grow up in one culture, you grow up in a monoculture, your language, your rituals, your stories, all those things are largely held in common. And so when you talk about something, when you use particular words, people are going to understand you're referring to that story, you're referring to that idea, you're referring to that practice. And it is very clear because everybody has the same stories, everybody has the same language, everybody has the same culture. We're part of a defined community. Somebody who's grown up between cultures, like a third culture kid is a great paradigm of this, doesn't have that framework, and is so and so recognizes. I recognize when I go into a community that I'm probably going to have to learn how they talk, what words mean to them, and so and I mean this was, as I said, this is how this was came up in a conversation.
Part of the problem of misunderstanding between me and you was that when you would say things like, as a third culture kid, when I go into a community, I realize that I have to understand them. I would still fail to understand how that was any different, because to me, I'm still having to do all the exact same things. In many ways, traveling through the world, having to make the same decisions, also being outside the dominant culture. Yet it's.
Do you understand the difference now?
The difference is that we approach. I mean, I would say that we're doing a common practice with a different backstory to it.
Yeah.
So the difference between a TCK and somebody from a minority community within a country, through much of their lives when they're away from their community, or when I'm away from my community, our experience is the same. But it's the stories we bring to it that are completely different. The things that we have to negotiate are the same. It's just we have completely different tools for doing it, and make different assumptions about how we're doing that. And
I think, that's a good place to close this, actually. I think that was one of the main points of the conference, is being aware of that sense that we can use different language and yet still deal with the same issues.
Yeah.
And still approach those issues, even though we're like, I wouldn't talk about my community, but I can still be aware that I'm entering a different culture and that there are different things at stake in that culture. For example. Yeah. And I think, when we're dealing with it, even within a faith, it's absolutely important to be aware that we could be talking about the same thing, even though we say it fundamentally differently. And saying it differently isn't a matter of right or wrong, better or worse. It's just we have different histories, we have different cultures, we come from different paths.
Yet we're still facing the same life.
We still live in the same world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in many ways it's our coming to grips with the same world that is what we want to do.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a good place to stop.
All right, so this has been a Story in Life podcast with David and Dale. You can find us on the web, if you haven't already, at taanshi.blogspot.ca, taanshi.blogspot.ca,
or at the Story in Life group on Facebook. Thanks for listening.